Okay, I've decided to keep going with the childhood book theme. This is another book that's art I remember more than anything else story-wise. The book this time is called Stellaluna, and it's about a bat who's separated from her mother and is found by birds, or something like that. Again, the story is not what I most remember. I remember finding the baby bat really freaking cute, with its gigantic puppy dog eyes, and the expressions are also very good and expressive, which is sometimes hard to get on animals while still keeping them looking like real animals and not cartoons. But I think this book does it really well because these look like real bats, just cuter and more human-like in their faces and expressions. And I could only hope that this book has made other kids like bats more and be less scared of them, because I adore bats, and I think this could have been where that obsession started. I think people who are afraid of bats only think of vampire bats, which are admittedly kind of freaky looking, and the idea of an actual vampiric creature probably is why they can seem kind of freaky, since vampires have been a scary story and mythos for a lot of different cultures through a lot of different time periods, so it makes sense that people would be inherently freaked out by the thought of real vampires. But vampire bats don't really drink from humans. Instead, they go after cattle and other livestock, and they aren't actually the only creatures to do this, as there's also a vampiric type of bird. It's a finch from the Galapagos Islands, and it's part of my favorite example of divergent evolution. The Galapagos Islands is actually a really great place to see examples of this in action, because islands can isolate certain species, and can have them adapt to that island's particular environment and challenges. And one of these examples are in the finches on the different islands, who evolve different types of beaks for specializing in a particular type of prey or food. Some evolve to peck trees for bugs, other evolving beaks to better crush seeds open, and the vampire finch developed a knife for a beak and would find their nutrients and meals by cutting open other animals and drinking their blood, including other birds, like the seabirds that also travel to these islands. So vampire bats are hardly the freakiest animal out there, and at least they only do 2 little needle pricks and don't slash their prey open like the finches do. But people also forget that bats, along with spiders, 2 groups of animals people usually fear, almost single-handedly keep our world and our food supply chains running smoothly, as they are amazing pest control, and without them, our fields of food would be quickly devoured by pest bugs. Bats eat a ton of bugs, too. Close to 100% of their body weight, they eat in bugs in a single night. That's like a 150-pound person eating 150 pounds of food in a single day. A nursing bat like Stellaluna's mother, because yes, they are mammals, so they do make milk, she would be catching around over 4,000 bugs a night. However, I don't think Stellaluna is actually that type of bat. In the book, they find and eat from a mango tree, which I made sure to add here in the painting. That means they're probably fruit bats, which are honestly just as interesting and also helpful as their vampiric or insectivore cousins, as they are seed dispersers, the same way some tropical birds are, as they'll fly around and release, aka poo, seeds as they go, which help replant rainforests. And they can also get, huge, like the flying fox, which is aptly named because it's like the size of a small dog. If you're afraid of vampire bats, imagine one getting this big. But luckily, the really big bats do tend to be fruit eaters. The difference in size between the world's smallest and largest bats is almost comical and definitely shows off their different lifestyles, as microbats eat mostly bugs, which are like half their size, and the bigger bats don't really need to actively hunt down fruit, so it makes sense they can stuff themselves easier calorie-wise and grow to the size that they are. Now, I won't pretend I'm not afraid of bats, but it's not because how they look or how they are, but because they are the most likely animal to carry rabies, which is actually something out of a horror movie. It doesn't just look scary like bats or spiders, but is actually horrifying. It rewires your whole brain and keeps you from even drinking water, which is something that is, required for living, because the virus wants the infected saliva of their host to be as concentrated as possible. That's terrifying. That it almost knows. I know it doesn't actually have a brain, it just evolved to better pass itself along, but it almost feels like it's aware to what is most important to our survival, and specifically targeting that. And in the case of those microbats, you would hardly even notice one land on or bite you, and if it had rabies, you wouldn't know until you started showing symptoms. And by that point, it has a nearly 100% fatality rate, and that's the biggest reason I will never be touching a bat, even if I find them super duper cute. But if you just keep your distance and get your rabies vaccine, you'll be fine. And I feel like even for people who are anti-vax, I feel like if you take the plunge and vaccinate for anything, it should be rabies, because what an awful and horrific and preventable way to die. But anyways, I've actually been lucky enough to see bats hunt back when I lived in the country at sunset, before it got too dark to see. Sometimes you could catch glimpses of the bats flying over our front lawn. We always had these little clusters of gnats that would accumulate in the yard, and the bats seemed attracted to them. So if you sat out there at the right time and were lucky enough, you could watch them hunt from the porch. That is something I am going to miss, living closer to town. That and lightning bugs, I've yet to see any while living here, but it might not be the right time of year yet to spot them, as they usually come out later into the summer. Same with bats. Right now, and during the earlier and harsher months of winter, bats are actually away hibernating. I remember hearing once that you're not really supposed to go into caves and bother them, at that time particularly. One, because you could get an unexpected face full of bats, but also because if they wake up, even a few times or even once, they could run out of energy before hibernation is supposed to be done, and they'll just drop from the cave ceiling dead of exhaustion. I don't know why people go into caves in general, as that's one thing I am scared of. I've heard way too many caving horror stories, but if you insist on going, probably don't do it in the winter. Least you genocide a population of bats, and also because caves are freezing in summer. You would for sure get hypothermia caving in winter. But that being said, we do have some interesting caves and rock formations around here, which I think is somewhat special in Indiana. A lot of Indiana is just flat fields, but a lot of caves that I've seen in the national parks around here have been boarded up with enough space to see in and let things like bats or snakes or other wildlife in, while keeping people out, probably to help the bats and animals be left alone, but also because these caves are not maintained and not safe for people to be poking around in, as it could cave in and really hurt or kill people, but I guess that really hasn't stopped people from caving before. But anyways, we lived pretty close to one said park while living in the country. It was less than a 3-minute drive down the road, and so maybe that's why there were bats around. The one thing I miss about that house when moving is the wildlife. I used to sometimes just see deer or raccoons or rabbits basically on our back deck, and I used to feed crows who would come by every day like clockwork. And I definitely miss that, but who knows, maybe I can attract crows again here. It just took ages to build trust with the last ones, so it would probably take a while here, especially because crows are naturally cautious and suspicious, and I doubt that they would be super willing to stick around through the neighbor's dogs barking or the active construction site that is our neighborhood, since they have barely even scratched the surface of the houses that they plan to put here, and they just added upwards of 50 to maybe even 100 new available lots to their website. That and the 50 or so houses that were already here, I think the plan is around 200 total houses, so if I want to feed the crows and wait until that dies down, it'll probably be a while. But anyways, maybe someday after things do quiet down around here, and the neighbors start planting flowers, and the trees that got planted with each house start to actually get big, there will be more wildlife, because that's the only thing I find myself still missing about that old place. I even saw a woodchuck once, in a tree right on the other side of the road, just a few meters away from my room. It was awesome. But even if I never get quite the same experiences again, I guess I'm just happy to have got the experience at all in the first place. And I still have photos and memories of all those cool sightings. So at least there's that. I got kind of sidetracked from bats for a moment there, but I'm almost done with this lovely lady. I thought about making her wings more transparent and see-through, and let more moonlight in, but it would be so easy to mess everything up, and I'm not even sure it would look good and give the effect I wanted. So I just kept it simple, and I worry it's too similar to my bunny vampire painting, but honestly, that might actually be fitting, since it is a vampire and kind of has wings that I based off of a bat. So who knows, maybe it actually works here. But I'm almost done with this part of my wall. One more, and I could start trying to squeeze even more onto the walls I already have done.